What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing something I've been wanting to do here on the channel since the very early days of starting that channel, and that's talk about the Austin Powers trilogy, the International Man of Mystery, the Spy Who Shagged Me, and Austin Powers in Goldmember, the full Austin Powers trilogy. Man, it had been quite some time since I'd watched these movies, and the beauty of having a channel like this where you touch on movies is the fact that there's really an endless supply of things to touch on, whether it be old nostalgic picks like this, or the newer stuff that I'm keeping up with, or just some classics maybe that I just never checked out. I'm always excited to talk about different things here, but something that I've always loved about doing this channel is going back and revisiting those films that were pivotal in my love for film becoming a thing. And the Austin Powers trilogy, without a doubt, is a pivotal role in my love specifically for comedies, but specifically satirical comedies that are essentially homages and parodies to films of the olden days. And in the case of this, of course, Austin Powers is a parody of James Bond, as he too is a British spy with all sorts of gadgets. He usually has his Austin Powers girl in the film, similar to a Bond girl, and throughout the course of each of these movies, he deals with a bunch of over-the-top antics and deals with a villain who is also very much a response to a lot of those villains you'd see in a James Bond film. And the Austin Powers films, as well as things like Undercover Brother, were pivotal for me in terms of just like really understanding the satirical comedy parody genre, so to speak. And while I don't think these films are for everyone, and nor do I think these are films that could be made today in terms of what they say, what they do, and what happens in them, and it's kind of sad that movies like this can't be made anymore, I just love that these films just went for it. They did not hold back. They made fun of everything and everyone. And when I was a kid, maybe I shouldn't have been watching these as often as I did. I just remember having so much fun with them and just always having an appreciation for the goofy. And Austin Powers was definitely a key element in that becoming a reality for me. Now, before I get into my thoughts individually on these movies, though, I feel like I need to touch on why I'm revisiting these films after all this time. And the easy way to say it is that I used to own these films on DVD. But I also mentioned on this channel before that I grew up in a Christian household. I used to be in a Christian private school, used to go to church multiple times a week, did youth groups, all that kind of stuff. And then one year, a youth group that I was a part of decided to go to this event called Acquire the Fire, or ATF for short. And the base gist of this was that it was a 3-day, I believe, conference, which was essentially a long sermon. And you had different preachers come out, and one main pastor or preacher who was giving a sermon that all connected throughout the course of the weekend. Throughout the course of that weekend, they'd also have big musical acts from various Christian artists that were popular, as well as some skits that would tie into the overall sermon. Now, when we returned from this event, though, my youth group decided to hold a bonfire that was essentially meant to purge ourselves of anything that was secular that was holding us back from our walk with Christ. I no longer am Christian. I have no hate for anybody who is still Christian. I choose to be agnostic these days, but I look back on this with a lot of horror because I decided to take a couple things like video games and some CDs, but most notably things like the Austin Powers trilogy, and throw them into this fire. And so I have not owned the Austin Powers films since then. That was when I was a teenager, and I honestly hadn't seen these films in a little bit over 10 years, and a big reason was because I just didn't own the physical copies to watch them myself. And so I ended up buying them again on Blu-ray to touch on them here in this video. And so now that we're done with that big intro on my thoughts on the Austin Powers films as a whole and why they were important to me, let's touch on the specifics. I will say, though, I'm going to be not spoiling everything, but just talking about these films kind of freely. So if you've never seen these films at all and you don't want to hear anything about them, and maybe you're interested in checking them out at some point, then maybe this video isn't for you. But I do want to say that if you've never seen the Austin Powers films, quickly, for anybody who, you know, hasn't seen them before and just wants to know if they're good or not, I just genuinely think these are just fun, over-the-top films. They know what they are. They don't take themselves too seriously. They break the fourth wall, and they essentially ask you as an audience to just have fun. And there's literally sequences in these movies where they break the fourth wall, look at the audience, and say, just enjoy the movie that you're watching and don't really pay attention too much to the details, because these movies are meant to be ridiculous and stupid and in so many ways not make sense. Now, without further ado, let's get into my thoughts on the original film, which is still my favorite one today, and that is Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, which came out in 1997 and was directed by Jay Roach, written by Mike Myers, who's also stars in the film as Austin Powers, also stars people like Elizabeth Hurley as Vanessa Kensington. You also have Michael York in here as Basil, Robert Wagner as Number 2, Seth Green as Scott Evil, Mindy Sterling as Frau, and you even have people like Will Ferrell in here as Mustafa. And of course, Mike Myers does play multiple characters over the course of these films, most notably in this one, Dr. Evil, the villain of the series. And man, this movie was so much fun to go back and revisit. I had so much fun watching it. Mike Myers is just a gem. I just love him as an actor. I always have. And I love that he just commits to ridiculous roles. You know, I love that he can be a really heartwarming character with something like Shrek. But that you can watch a movie like this and he's playing this over-the-top, sexualized British spy who has bad teeth and a super hairy chest and is just wanting to get it on with women everywhere he can. He's irresistible to them as well, while also being this incredibly cunning and clever spy. And a lot of times just being both the smartest person in the room and equally the dumbest person in the room in so many moments. And he plays it in a way that's just so authentic to who he is as an actor, but also who he is as that character. I think he really captures the essence of Austin Powers so well that I just genuinely couldn't even imagine someone else in that role. And it's awesome that he's one of the main writers of all of these films, with this one mainly only being credited to him as a writer. He clearly had a vision for where he wanted to take this character and how he wanted to play this character, and working alongside Jay Roach, you can clearly tell they had a vision for what this movie was going to be all about. And the basic gist of this film is that Dr. Evil has shot himself off into space and has cryo-frozen himself, so to make sure that Austin Powers is available to take out Dr. Evil whenever he returns, they decide to cryo-freeze him. This ends up happening in the 60s, and of course we end up shooting to the 90s where this film takes place, where now he's being thawed out because Dr. Evil is back. And there's just so much fun to be had in this film. He ends up being put back onto the job, and we're instantly introduced to Elizabeth Hurley, who is Vanessa Kensington, as I mentioned, who is the niece of the original Mrs. Kensington that he worked alongside in the 60s, who's now a much older woman and not involved in this story. Over the course of the film, Austin Powers as well as Mrs. Kensington, or Vanessa, must work together now to try and stop Dr. Evil with his big plan to take over the world. In each of these films, there's running gags, a lot of times making fun of something from the previous film or recurring a joke. There's even certain parts of these movies where they make reference to the fact that the joke is being reused in a different way and slightly altered in the next film. And so in the case of this film, one joke that it definitely establishes is the fact that because they're jumping out of time, Dr. Evil is not really in touch with how much money is worth in this day and age. So he initially comes out, asks for a certain amount of money that's significantly lower than is even threatening these days, and of course has to bump it up. It's a pretty stupid and silly gag, but they do it in each of these movies, and I always thoroughly enjoy it. Mike Myers is fantastic as Dr. Evil as well, because that's something that I think a lot of people forget, is that he plays both characters because he does it so well. Not that I really think people forget that, but in case you don't know it, you could easily be deceived that maybe another actor is under that makeup, because he plays the character so differently than the way he plays Austin Powers. And I kind of miss the day and age where we had actors playing various characters in a movie. It was such a clever and fun thing. It was able to be silly and ridiculous and very self-referential, and it was a lot of times a great way to kind of showcase the talent of a specific actor. And while we haven't really seen that in this day and age, it's nice to go back and revisit a time where that was a little bit more common, and I think that Mike Myers just nails it as Dr. Evil. Quite frankly, I would almost say that he might be the best character I feel in the Austin Powers films, and I just love the nuances of humor and the way he gets angry in certain moments, the way he's both caring and also selfish and vile while also being just kind of cute in other moments. The way he's able to capture this kind of innocent, dumb, but also intelligent essence with both Austin Powers and Dr. Evil, but in a completely different way with both of them, I think is pretty awesome. Eventually, Dr. Evil is stopped by Austin Powers and Vanessa, as they are pretty easily able to escape all of the things he tries to capture them with. This leads to Dr. Evil once again being frozen out into space. He disappears once again, and now Austin Powers has changed his ways, no longer wants to be a man who's going after all these different women. He wants to become a one-woman person, and he decides to get married to Vanessa Kensington, played by Elizabeth Hurley, which ends with their wedding and shows us them starting to have a fantastic time in the bedroom. But now we instantly have to jump on over to the next film in the franchise, The Spy Who Shagged Me, that came out 2 years later in 1999 and is once again directed by Jay Roach. This time around, Mike Myers shares writing duties with Mike McCullers, and the film stars everybody from the last film, as well as some new faces like the new Austin Powers girl, played by Heather Graham. She plays Felicity Shagwell, and of course, the introduction of one of the most iconic characters in all of cinema, Mini-Me, played by Vern Troyer. Now, I'll start this one off by saying that I like The Spy Who Shagged Me. I enjoyed it more when I was younger, and rewatching it now, in a lot of ways, while it's still entertaining, I think there's plenty of fun to still be had, and I think it has one of the best openings in one of these films, which I have to say as well, all of the openings in all of the Austin Powers films are just tons of fun. They set you up for the tone of the film. They ask you to just have good fun. They're all similar with some sort of musical number that, of course, is just the main Austin Powers theme song, and he's just dancing to it. Usually has a whole dance number of people that get involved in the whole situation, and Mike Myers just commits fully to these moments visually. He gives so much to all of this in terms of body humor, his face, the timing of his movements, everything about the cadence of how he goes about the beginning of all these intros is top tier, and the second film is no different. We learn right off the top, which is kind of disappointing rewatching it all these years later in terms of story, that Vanessa, played by Elizabeth Hurley once again at the very start of this film, actually is a fembot, and now we learn that she is out here trying to kill Austin Powers and that their marriage was entirely fake. And that was disappointing just based on how her character plays out in the first film. You know, she's caring, she slowly gets to liking Austin Powers over the course of the film. At first she's really annoyed with him. By the time you get to the end of the first film, she's kind of grown to enjoy how over the top he is, but you know, pretty much makes him a one gal guy. And at the very start of this movie, we find out that she was just a robot the whole time, and she tries to kill him. They play it off as a gag, and he is just excited that he's single again, and that leads us into that opening intro big dance number. And so it's kind of disappointing if you watch the first film and go straight into the second one or watch them close to one another. It's supposed to play on how ridiculous these old spy films were from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but as a story, I think I really enjoyed Vanessa probably the most as any of the Austin Powers girls. So to kind of see her be just kind of thrown away at the start of the second movie as just a threat to Austin Powers that he takes out immediately, and she's no longer his love interest, is a bit of a disappointment. So the base premise of this one is that Dr. Evil is back though once again, and he ends up going back to when Austin Powers was cryo-frozen and decides to steal his mojo. So now in real time, he's realizing that he's lost his mojo and he's not on top of his game anymore, nor can he get it on with women anymore. This prompts him to go back in time, which is where we get one of the sequences where the character of Basil literally looks at the audience when Austin Powers is wondering how time travel works and how confusing it gets. He looks straight at Austin Powers and says, hey, you know, don't worry about it, just have fun, and then looks straight at the camera and says, and that goes for you guys as well. I love that these films are just incredibly self-referential and that they're literally just asking you to enjoy how stupid these movies are, which I recognize is not for everybody, but for me, I appreciate in this day and age where we all get so caught up in like deep narrative that when you can watch a movie that isn't trying to focus on deep narrative and is just trying to be almost a sketch comedy, that you can just have fun with it. Unfortunately, though, that's where this film kind of loses me, though, is that this one, more so than the first and the third film, feels more like it's about sketch comedy and moments of humor and skits, more so than it does like an actual story. To get back to the story, you have Austin Powers going back in time once again to when he was cryo-frozen at the end of the late 60s to try to stop Dr. Evil and get his mojo back. And of course, throughout all this, that's where he's introduced to Heather Graham's character, Felicity Shagwell. The two of them work together once again to defeat Dr. Evil, who again is totally fine at the end of the film and essentially just scurries off just like in the previous film. And you know, this is the last time that we see Heather Graham character as we move into the next film, because everything is okay and dandy. Austin Powers ends up going back to his own time, and Heather Graham's character Felicity decides to stay in her own time. And outside of specifically Austin Powers and Felicity, there's so much great stuff in this movie with Dr. Evil and Mini-Me. I mean, it definitely goes to show why the character of Mini-Me and Dr. Evil were so popular back in the day. They were just such pop culture icons of the time, and this movie definitely showcases why. There's so many great moments between Mike Myers and Vern Troyer where they're playing these two characters, but you can just tell they were having a blast playing these characters. And Vern Troyer as Mini-Me is so funny because he's both ridiculously cute at times, but also horrifying in other moments and grotesque, and he plays it all so well. And if you've ever seen interviews with Vern Troyer, who unfortunately has passed away since, and I know suffered from a lot of alcoholism, then you know that he was a completely different guy than he was as that character. So he just really had fun playing Mini-Me. That much is definitely clear when you're watching it in the movie. And with that, now let's move on to the third and final film in this trilogy, and that is Austin Powers in Goldmember, once again directed by Jay Roach and written by Mike Myers and Michael McCullers, and once again stars everybody I've mentioned before from the first film. And the biggest new faces to touch on here is you have Beyoncé as Foxy Cleopatra, the new Austin Powers girl. You also have Michael Caine as Nigel Powers, the father to Austin Powers, as well as at the very end of the film we learn the same father to Dr. Evil. And you have Fred Savage in here as Molly Molly Mole number 3. And going back and revisiting this one, I remember enjoying it, but I actually thought in my head that this was maybe my least favorite of the bunch. But I'm very happy to say that I really thoroughly enjoyed this film, found it to be a good time going back and revisiting it. I still think the first one is my favorite one of the bunch, but I think there's definitely some really great moments in this movie. And Mike Myers, once again, just gives it his all, man. He just never really strayed away from what this character is. You know, a lot of times when you see multiple sequels of a character in each movie, and just little by little they just feel a little bit less like themselves. It almost feels a little bit less like the actors as invested by the time you get to later sequels, especially at a specific time in cinema where it felt like it was more about money than it was the actual movies. With the case of Austin Powers, Mike Myers was just clearly involved in the entire process, of course, with the writing, but also in just the way he was going to portray this character. And once again, you just have a fantastic portrayal as Austin Powers that leaves you with plenty of laughs, and again is able to capture this essence of silliness and stupidity, but also just being the most clever guy in the room all at the same time. And you know what, I was just about to mention the fact that one of the most important parts about this film is the character of Goldmember, who is also played by Mike Myers. But in just kind of paraphrasing my thoughts about these movies here in this video, I just realized that I made a very big mistake, which is not mentioning that Mike Myers also plays Fat Bastard in the sequel, The Spy Who Shagged Me, who was another key role in pop culture at the time. Get in my belly. That was such a popular line for such a long time. There are so many quotable lines from all these films, but the get in my belly, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've even said that when I was a kid, or heard people say that when I was a kid, or how many movies referenced it. I mean, it was one of the most iconic lines in movies at the time, and I can't believe, in paraphrasing my thoughts on these movies, that I forgot to mention him during that second film. So I do apologize, but he's also in this film as well. And I think Mike Myers, once again, top tier outside of just playing Austin Powers, because he has to do Dr. Evil. He also is playing Fat Bastard again here, and a new villain in the film known as Goldmember. Now, the base premise of this film is, once again, Austin Powers must go back in time, this time to find somebody called Goldmember, because his father, Nigel Powers, played by Michael Caine, has gone missing. He goes back in time, ends up finding his father, and goes on an adventure to try to stop Dr. Evil and Goldmember. And of course, throughout all this, ends up meeting his Austin Powers girl, who's played by Beyoncé, and probably my favorite role by her. She plays the character of Foxy Cleopatra, and we learn instantly that both her and Austin already had some sort of intimate relationship. But this time we time travel back to the 70s, and at this point Austin has been cryo-frozen this entire time, so she has no idea where he up and went to, and so he has to try to kind of win her heart back. The two end up teaming up to try to stop Dr. Evil and Goldmember and save Nigel Powers. And of course, throughout the course of the film, there's tons of other antics with all these other characters, which ends up leading to even Mini-Me joining alongside Austin Powers and Beyoncé, and all ends in this big family reunion of sorts, where now you have Dr. Evil and Austin Powers learning that they're brothers. Mini-Me is getting in on the action as well. There's some great moments in there. Really thoroughly enjoyed the ending of this film, and Goldmember ends up being defeated, essentially. And one character that I've yet to talk about here, and that if I wanted to touch on everything in this film, it would just take me way too long to do, is the character of Scott Evil, played by Seth Green, who of course is the son of Dr. Evil, who's made in a lab from sperm from Dr. Evil. And his whole thing is that he hates his dad. He's essentially the teenager who just feels like he was abandoned by Dr. Evil. He kind of just plays that angsty teenager from the 90s or the 2000s pretty much in all of these movies, up until the very end, where he starts to become more and more evil, just as Dr. Evil is learning that Austin Powers is his brother and wants to no longer live an evil life. He kind of throws that behind him and now is happy to know that he has a family. And so now Scott Evil is essentially pissed off and becomes the new Dr. Evil, as everybody else has kind of left him. And his character isn't really massively integral to the story. He's kind of just the butt of a joke for majority of it, but it is kind of funny to see the trajectory of his character when you go from the very beginning, where he is just that angsty teenager who wants nothing to do with Dr. Evil and thinks he's lame, and ultimately becomes just like the person that he hated in the first film. While there's so many other things I can touch on when it comes to the Austin Powers films, again, I'd be here forever doing that, but I had a blast going back and revisiting it, and I hope you guys enjoyed just hearing me talk about it. And I want to hear your guys' like memories and opinions on the Austin Powers films. When did you first see these films? What did they mean to you? What are some of your favorite, maybe parody, satirical films? Definitely leave any and all of those comments down below. But one thing I could not end this video without doing is touching on some of the references and most notably the cameos that are in these movies. And if I tried to list them all off, again, I'd be here for a long time. But these films are jam-packed with things like product placement from things like Starbucks, as well as a bunch of cameos from people like Tom Cruise, Danny DeVito, Gwyneth Paltrow, Ozzy Osbourne, Willie Nelson, Vanilla Ice. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There are so many. They've crammed so many cameos in these films, and a lot of times they're used in just the right way to be funny. And again, I just think they had such a great vision with these films. For me, the ranking would easily be the first one, the best one, International Man of Mystery. The second one for me would definitely have to be Goldmember, with my least favorite being the middle film, which is The Spy Who Shagged Me. A good follow-up to the first one, but in a lot of ways felt very samey to that first one. And I think that while the third one stays consistent tonally to all three of them, it's definitely the one film that feels like it does something a little bit differently than the first film, introduces new characters that are really important to the story. And I think that the first and the third one feel the most important in terms of character arcs, but that second one is still plenty of fun. And ultimately, when it comes down to just films I will always have a special place in my heart for, even if they've become dated in so many ways, even if the humor is something that we wouldn't see in movies today, I think the Austin Powers films will easily always be one of my favorite sets of movies of all time, and I look forward to hearing all of your guys' opinions on these movies down below in the comment section. So leave some love down there. Let me know what you guys think about these movies, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.